Hello.
Okay. Hi.
All right, so I'm going to make some opening remarks, and then I'll give an opportunity for Chris to add anything he wants to throw in. And just because we have the same ideology, Chris and I may not necessarily have the same interpretation. I think we're pretty close, but I'm just going to make some comments, and then Chris can jump in afterwards. First of all, today is May 4th, and this is the anniversary of the Kent State Massacre. In 1970, there was a group of students who were protesting at Kent State University. They were protesting the Vietnam War and the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. And the National Guard opened fire on them. They had no weapons. And 4 students, 2 of them were protesters, 2 of them were just bystanders, were killed. And there were other people who were disabled for life in wheelchairs. There were people who lost their hands. It was a horrendous moment. And one thing I think all of us here can agree on is that moment in American history was a disaster. That event was utterly horrendous. And while all of us here have different ideologies and different perspectives and different backgrounds, we're all anti-war. And we also all believe in freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Right now, the fact that the Uhuru movement, 4 Black revolutionary activists are being charged, indicted as Russian agents, facing a possible 10 years in prison for their speech advocating peace and cooperation with Russia, opposing U.S. escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. That's something we can all be outraged about. But if you look at that moment, 1970, when this horrendous massacre happened, one thing that's worth pointing out is at the time, among, the rural folks and the working class people who live in the areas around Kent, Ohio, there was a lot of hatred for those protesters. There was a lot of feeling those protesters were unpatriotic. They were disloyal to the country. They were disrespecting the military. And there was a lot of support for the Vietnam War. But if you go to Kent, Ohio now, and I would know because I grew up near there, you won't find support for U.S. interventions and wars around the world among the population there. People in small towns like the one I grew up in, people in rural communities and working class communities throughout this country are realizing that the problems we're facing here in America are much closer to home. People need good paying jobs. People need their roads to be paved. They need water to be properly purified. They need to deal with the inflation and the rising costs of food and gasoline. And I must point out that people don't realize how bad it is sometimes. But in 27 different U.S. states, they are literally unpaving the roads. They have a machine called a reclaimer. And the reclaimer is this machine that pulls up the asphalt and it pulverizes it and replaces a paved road with a gravel or dirt road. And it doesn't take a PhD in economics to realize that if your country is going from paved roads to dirt roads, there's something really, really wrong in the economy. This is regression, and we're seeing it all across the heartland of America. Now, I am going to focus tonight in my remarks not so much on capitalism versus communism, because that's an argument that people like me and Jorge can have back and forth. We can argue about the history of the 20th century and socialist economics and the Austrian school and libertarianism and Deng Xiaoping theory and Mao Zedong thought. We can argue about that all night. But I'm on here arguing as a representative of the Center for Political Innovation, focused on how we can get our country out of this economic devastation and out of the danger of a new world war, which would only make things worse overwhelmingly for the country. And right now, I look at China, a country that is historically one of the poorest countries in the world. But over the course of decade after decade since their 1949 revolution, has lifted itself up, become the second largest economy in the world, raised 800 million people out of poverty, built the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer, a state-controlled mega corporation called Huawei Technologies, makes half the steel in the world. I see an economic powerhouse, an industrial, poverty alleviation, technological innovation powerhouse on the Chinese mainland. And I've got to think that Joe Biden, and to some extent Donald Trump, must be very, very stupid to think it's in the interest of the United States of America to cut itself off from this economic powerhouse, from this poverty alleviation factory. If you look at what China has achieved, why in the world would we not want to be part of it? Countries all over the world are joining the Belt and Road Initiative, benefiting from the high-speed railway that's built by the China Railway Corporation, benefiting from the great infrastructure projects that China is promoting. Why would we want to cut ourselves off from this? It would just be a foolish thing to do economically. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't regulate trade in certain ways. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have certain protections for American industries or American workers. But this idea that China is to blame for America's economic woes is ridiculous. The reason that American workers are suffering right now so badly is because of neoliberalism. Free market economics has driven this country into poverty, has caused the good-paying industrial jobs to go overseas, has led to a situation where we in the United States have got a mountain of debt. Household debt is through the roof. The real basis of our economy, the infrastructure, the physical economy has been hollowed out. And we basically have a country that's ruled by big banks and oil monopolists that see the United States just as one outpost in a global financial empire. They see the whole world getting poorer so that they can make themselves rich, controlling the trade routes, the classic British Empire Atlanticist model that Lenin called imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And I view the future of the United States not as making China our enemy, but as teaming up with China. Imagine that we hired the China Railway Corporation to team up with American companies and build high-speed railroads across the Midwest. Imagine that American scientists and American computer engineers could team up with Chinese engineers and Chinese scientists and start making cutting-edge breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and new technological innovations. That's the future. China is speeding forward. They started speeding forward in their 1949 revolution, and they really escalated after their 1978 reform and opening up. And the United States should not make the mistake of cutting itself off from this powerhouse of economics just because that's what the big monopolies that run the United States feel is in their interest, as opposed to the interest of the overall population. You want to throw anything in, Chris?
No, I would echo everything that you've said. And I would also say that it's important when looking at China and the United States. China was historically oppressed for 2 centuries by Western imperialism, by the British who forced opium. The first major drug trade and mafia was the British Empire. So when you look at how China perceives countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, and other European countries, they cannot forget. They cannot necessarily forgive what was done to China, to the Chinese people, to the millions that became addicted to the opium that was shoved down their throats, to the cantons that were created and the concessions and everything that were torn apart from the Chinese nation. Of course, we have what the West wants, a new one, Taiwan, which is part of the Chinese homeland, but is trying to be wrenched away by the United States and its allies. So we have to understand, all of us here, that China and the United States are intimately tied economically. Any separation will be disastrous, and we must prevent a new Cold War from developing. Thank you.
All right. Well, I just want to give some proper historical context to all of this, because when you're talking about China, we're talking about a 5,000-year civilization, and you have to put all of this in context. People don't understand in the United States why Taiwan is so important. Before the Chinese Communist Party came to power, you had the century of humiliation. And that was a time where China was a dirt poor country, mass poverty. There would be deaths of malnutrition all the time, mass illiteracy, mass underdevelopment. I mean, if you go and read the novels of Pearl Buck, I mean, you're describing a level of poverty that is beyond what we can imagine. I mean, we're describing a huge amount of just backwardness economically. We're talking about people that were still living in like the Middle Ages in terms of economic development. The way China was kept in that situation was by keeping it divided. The British, they waged their 2 opium wars and basically forced China to open up, and allow British multinational corporations to dominate their economy, Hong Kong was broken away from China as a result of those opium wars, turned into a British protectorate. You had in Tibet, you had a feudal kingdom run by the Dalai Lama. In many areas, you had regional warlords who did not recognize the central government, and they just kind of ruled on their own. And it was a disaster. And Japan controlled parts of China, and it was a disaster. And what the Chinese Communist Party has basically, hung its hat on is that they have created one China. They have held China together as a country because historically, not just in China, but also in Russia and the former Soviet Union, when countries and regions in that part of the world are unified and together, that's when development happens. That's when industrialization happens. That's when educational levels are increased. But when they're divided, that's when they're weaker. And Zbigniew Brzezinski knew about this. He wrote his whole book, The Grand Chessboard, about Eurasia and how to ensure U.S. domination of Eurasia by keeping it divided. He makes that point. And this has been a big part of the war hawks and the neocons' strategy for dominating the world, has been dividing the Eurasian hemisphere, and playing different parts of the former Soviet Union and different parts of China against each other. You'll remember that for a long time, the government on Taiwan, which is the government of Chiang Kai-shek, it calls itself the Republic of China. And for many years, the U.S. had diplomatic relations not with the government in Beijing, but with the government on Taiwan. And the UN seat of China was held by the government on Taiwan. Can you imagine how humiliating that was for China, a country with over 1 billion people, to have this tiny island holding their UN seat, their seat on the UN Security Council, that they won as winners of the Second World War? They were being recognized with this island of Taiwan recognized by the United States. It was just a huge disgrace and humiliation and slap in the face to China. The USA funded the Tibet Civil War. People forget about the Tibet Civil War. Over 500,000 people died because during the 1950s, the USA was airdropping Tibetan extremists who wanted to bring the Dalai Lama back to power into the mountains of Tibet, who burned healthcare clinics, who murdered literacy volunteers. It was 500,000 people died in the 1950s in the Tibet Civil War. The USA has been doing everything it can to divide China. Recently, U.S. media has been playing up, Uyghur separatism, Islamic separatism in the Uyghur regions, and that this has been a big part of U.S. foreign policy, this idea that we're going to take China apart in order to humiliate the Communist Party and make the case that they shouldn't be in power because they can't hold the country together. Now, U.S. policy, U.S. law is the same as what China wants, which is that they feel that eventually the government on Taiwan and the mainland will reunify. They'll become economically closer and closer and more tied in with each other. They'll realize it's in their interest, and gradually, one step at a time, we will see one country, two systems come to an end, and Taiwan and China be completely unified with one government. That is the understanding. And when the USA established relations with China, it was understood that that would be U.S. policy. But now we see the United States doing everything it can in the opposite direction. And the reason that the United States is doing this, it serves no other purpose than to try and provoke and insult the government on the mainland. That is the only purpose it serves. If you think that the USA cares about the people living on the island of Taiwan, ask yourself why they're doing everything possible to try and make the situation that's happening in Ukraine happen on the island of Taiwan. If you care about the people on the island of Taiwan, regardless of what you think about their nationality or whether they're part of China or not, you wouldn't want them to die. And that is what U.S. leaders are doing by piling weapons in there, by having a member of the U.S. Congress go to the island of Taiwan and compare Xi Jinping to Hitler, Nancy Pelosi's provocative visit. I mean, all of this is nothing but an effort to insult the Chinese Communist Party, to say they're not worthy to lead China because they can't deliver on having a unified country, and to provoke a situation where the Chinese Communist Party will feel that they have to maintain their credibility by militarily intervening. And that would be a disaster for the whole world, especially for the people living on the island where that military confrontation would take place. And at this point, as you know, U.S. efforts to divide China have continued. The Chinese Communist Party, by creating one China, has really carried out a policy of really lifting people out of poverty and proving that China is better when it's together economically, when people are trading with each other. I mean, look, before the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1928, the novelist Edgar Snow, he wasn't a novelist, a journalist, Edgar Snow, he was living in China and he witnessed a horrendous famine that took place. 1928, millions and millions of people died in China due to a famine that happened. And he was there and he saw that this famine didn't have to happen. It happened because there was no strong central government that could take food from the regions that weren't having a famine and bring it to the areas that weren't. It was happening because fields that should have been growing food for people to eat were growing opium poppies, for the British Empire and for the drug trade. And he looked at it and he said, why don't people rise up and revolt against this? And China has fought very, very hard to have a strong central government that can make sure the country starts to develop. And the USA has done everything it can to do the opposite, to divide China, to break apart different sections of China, to separate China. And that's not a good policy, because when China gets stronger, if we can do business with China and we can continue to trade with China, their success could be our success. And that's what people need to remember. A strong China is not a threat to the United States. We shouldn't be viewing these things in terms of a zero-sum game. That's the way it's being sold to us. If China does well, that means we do poorly. We should view China's success as good for us, because China doesn't want a confrontation with the United States. They would like their technological labs for Made in China 2025 to be joint technological labs with American tech companies and American corporations. They're standing there saying our success doesn't have to come at your expense. And the USA is sitting there saying, no, zero-sum game. We've got to stop you from rising, because if you continue to rise, then that cuts into us. That's the wrong way to look at it. Whenever conversation about China and the question of socialism versus capitalism is discussed, I often hear this logical fallacy, which is that, they say, well, China having such great success after their market reforms, starting the reform and opening up of 1978, proves that capitalism is the answer. That's a lot like saying that, it was very cold in my house the other night, so I turned the heat on. So therefore, that proves I should light my home on fire, because more heat is always the answer, because it got better after I turned the heat on. China has a largely planned economy. They have state-run industries. They have 5-year economic plans. Even private corporations are not free to do as is simply profitable for them. They're controlled by the party and told what to do. And that, yes, there are market mechanisms in China, and China was able to adjust its socialist system and not fall into the trap of the Soviet Union, not have the downfall. They were able to adjust. They were able to bend so they didn't break. But to describe China as an example of the free market working is just an illusion. And part of the reason that China has just continued to grow continuously has been because the Chinese Communist Party has control and guides the economy to continue growing. And I do want to add that while I do admire the achievements of the Chinese Revolution, they call their system socialism with Chinese characteristics. And when socialism comes to America, it's going to be completely different. We're going to develop some kind of socialism with American characteristics, intended to address the problems that exist on these very shores. However, there is a new economy that's emerging around the world. You've got China, you've got Iran, you've got Venezuela, you've got Russia, you've got many countries that have broken out of this dying Western Wall Street, London financial system that is just falling apart and grinding the world into poverty and trying to provoke a war or something so they can stay on top despite their failures. Well, I would like the United States to break out of that system as well and find our own route to an economy where the banks and the factories and the major centers of economic power are organized to serve public good, not simply the profits of a wealthy few. And we can trade and have good relations with countries around the world on the basis of win-win cooperation. And we can march toward that ideal of a world with so much wealth and so much abundance that the very need for a state could fade away, and we could have a society where people just kind of get to do what they feel like doing and take what they need from each according to their own ability, to each according to their need, the ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world based on vast abundance. Thank you.